Hey everyone, welcome. We're going to give a couple minutes here as folks trickle in and then we will get started. And you should see we are going to record this webinar, so it will be available after as well, but just a heads up that we are going to record. Okay, I think the folks who are in the waiting room are joined. So in the interest of time, let's just get started. Hi everyone, thank you for joining our webinar today on 2025 Hydrogen State Legislative Tracking. My name is Alana Hadland, and I'm an industry program coordinator at the Great Plains Institute on the Industrial Innovation and Carbon Management team. For those who might not be familiar with the Great Plains Institute, we're an organization dedicated to crafting nonpartisan, pragmatic energy solutions to benefit people, the economy, and the environment. I'm joined by my colleague, Emma, who will help advance the slides and keep an eye on the Q&A. So thank you, Emma, for your help. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, to get things started, I'm just going to briefly go over what our webinar will cover today. We have an hour together, so I'll do a bit of scene setting here. We'll look at how the legislative landscape has evolved some since GPI started tracking hydrogen legislation a few years ago. Next, I'll share a little bit about how we approached the analysis for 2025. And then we'll get into the bulk of today's session, and that's really going to look at those policy trend categories. And then finally, we're going to provide a quick synthesis of what we're anticipating in 2026, and then review a few key resources so folks on the call know where to find them. And just a little plug, Emma and I sent out our first 2026 Legislative Digest this morning. So if you did not receive it, please reach out to myself or my colleague Emma, and we can get you added to the list. And then the digest also has a link to the tracker, which is available anytime. The digest we send weekly, but you can access the tracker at any point. Next slide, please. Okay, so jumping in here, as I mentioned, GPI started tracking hydrogen legislation in 2023. And so this graph provides a really high-level view of the hydrogen legislation that we've tracked. One thing you'll hear me say bills a lot today, and just noting that we're using that as shorthand throughout today's conversation, but it includes all the legislation that we track. So that includes companion bills and then also resolutions. So the blue line on top indicates the number of bills introduced. It's not indicating, as you might see, how far any of those progressed. It's just a total quantity. And then the green line on the bottom indicates legislation that was enacted or adopted. So while enacted bills have decreased somewhat, there's been a really interesting jump from 2024 to 2025 in terms of the number of bills introduced. And my colleague Emma and I, if you joined our carbon management webinar, you might have heard her tell this joke, but we like to say maybe we're just getting that much better at tracking. All jokes aside, we really do see this as an indicator that these conversations related to hydrogen are definitely increasing, and that this was particularly the case looking from 2024 to 2025. And this can mean a lot of different things. And so some states have developed economies, or they're looking to further develop hydrogen economies. And then others are changing or considering the role that hydrogen can play. Next slide, please. Okay, so just another visual of some data. This chart provides additional insight into the 101 pieces of hydrogen-related legislation that we tracked and where they stood at the end of 2025. And so we've seen a few of these already carry over into 2026. And an example being Pennsylvania and Hawaii, which I can share more about in a bit. But as we can see from the third column, introduced or pre-filled, that's really where the majority of bills lie, while fewer advance. But ultimately, the rate of conversation and introduction of ideas is advancing, although advancement through the full legislative process remains fairly selective. And then another note, as I'm sure a lot of folks on the call are probably more familiar with some of these bills or very integrated into state work. And so we're really tracking these at a 30,000-foot view, but hopefully can get into some helpful context for you today. Next slide, please, Emma. Awesome, thank you. Okay, this map is showing there were a total of 23 states in 2025 that considered legislation related to hydrogen. A few things jump out. And so, in addition to it being distributed across 23 states, there are some regional pockets that stand out. And again, this is in terms of 2025 specifically. The second thing is that we can see it's the difference in color is a bit difficult, but the darker blue shows a higher concentration and the number of hydrogen bills considered in those states in 2025. And then we'll get into examples, but in addition to policy varying by location, it also the topic of policy varies, which we'll share more in a bit. And then we really do encourage you to explore the tracker. By no means will I walk through all 101 bills in our hour today, but if you really do want to dive in, the tracker has a link to the legislative sites of the respective states. And so you can really look into what contributed to some of these bills advancing further than others. Next slide, please. Okay, so I had mentioned that 23 states considered hydrogen bills in 2025. What was interesting is that actually 7 states accounted for over 2/3 of those bills. So this slide simply shows you each state and then the total number of hydrogen-related bills. And for example, looking at Minnesota, as we watched bills being introduced in Minnesota, we saw that there were 2 hydrogen amounts for different hydrogen projects that actually showed up in multiple bills before eventually that text landing in a legislative vehicle that ultimately passed. So we recognize that the number next to the state is influenced by a lot of different factors that we're not as closely analyzing right now such as a state's legislative context or how bills do typically progress from being introduced to finding a viable legislative vehicle. But again, the tracker is a great resource to really get into the detail there. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'll share a little bit more about how we approached the analysis for 2025. We landed on 5 primary categories. The first, governance and regulatory readiness, is really looking at who is regulating hydrogen, how authority is structured, and how different hydrogen programs operate. The second, planning, research, and strategy, looks at hydrogen's role in the broader state energy strategy, different studies that states are considering, either directly related to hydrogen or including it, and then also some natural gas innovation planning. The third category, infrastructure and deployment enablement, includes things like hydrogen pipelines. We saw some energy corridor planning that included hydrogen, and then also siting. The fourth category, market formation and incentives, includes things like appropriations, tax credits, performance-based incentives, and then several other interesting market mechanisms that states are considering. And then finally, symbolic and awareness was a category where we saw a lot of legislative activity, and this was specifically through resolutions, and was just an interesting category last year through things like states requesting the federal government to take particular action or announcing hydrogen days, which we'll share more about. Next slide. Okay, just giving you multiple views of sort of the same information before we get into more granular detail. This slide shows those same 5 categories, but it includes the total number of bills that were introduced in blue, and then it shows you the total number of those bills that were enacted in gray. And so when we were analyzing these bills, it's just important to note that a single bill doesn't typically fit well in one bucket. But for the purpose of the analysis in the webinar, we did just try to capture the primary intent of the hydrogen portion of the bill, but you'll definitely see some overlap during the conversation today. And then this is also the order that we will walk through bills today. Next slide, Emma. Okay, so diving into our first category, which is governance and regulatory readiness, we saw 12 states introduce 25 bills in this category. From the bar graph, you can see that these were further divided into 3 subcategories that we will also walk through in more detail. But similar, this graph format will become familiar during the call today. But we can see the darker purple is the total number of bills introduced in this subcategory, and then the lighter purple shows the number that were enacted. And across this category, generally we saw we saw states consider bills related to different standards and safety for hydrogen, legal authority and jurisdiction, and then also how to permit and approve hydrogen projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so digging into that first subcategory, which was standard safety and compliance requirements. So within the subcategory, we saw states considering topics like clean fuel, including hydrogen as one of those qualified clean fuels, different pipeline safety standards and how to monitor leakage, statutory compliance deadlines for reducing emissions in states, including how that affected hydrogen use, and then different taxation frameworks. So I'm not going to read through each example on every slide because we will share these after the webinar. And again, the tracker is really a great one-stop shop to dig in, but I'll try to just share one or two examples as we work through these. So both Hawaii and New Jersey, we see two different states kind of contemplating similar ideas. HB 1304 was looking to adopt rules for a clean fuel standard, and this is where we see hydrogen listed as a qualified alternative fuel. And then New Jersey A 3645 was also seeking to establish a mandatory low carbon transportation fuel standard. So again, not necessarily hydrogen as the primary focus, but seeing hydrogen as a qualified technology or fuel within these clean fuel standards. Next slide, please. All right, moving on to our second subcategory, and we're still under that broader governance and regulatory readiness, but now looking at legal authority, definitions, and jurisdiction. Within this subcategory, we were seeing states consider things around eminent domain, the role of local laws and regulations, common pipeline carrier status for hydrogen, also pipe fitting licensures, and hydrogen acting as a bit of a precedent or a template for other energy producers. So looking here, and I should have pointed out sooner, but as you can see next to Oklahoma SB 480, if one of the examples, and I've tried to include any that were enacted or passed, we will have in parentheses that it's one of those 12 that was enacted or passed. So looking at that as our example, Oklahoma SB 480 amended the definition of public utilities. And so current law prior to this actually exempt producers of green hydrogen from being classified as a public utility. And this law would actually extend that exemption to other types of energy producers who met certain specifications. So again, just an interesting way to see hydrogen kind of play out and inform how other energy producers can qualify, at least in Oklahoma. Next slide, please. Okay, the third and final subcategory in this section is permitting and approval processes. And within this subcategory, we saw states considering what approval processes look like for hydrogen projects. We also saw some energy planning corridors and how hydrogen can be involved in those, and then also how to streamline permitting and development, as well as environmental impact analyses. So we do have several examples here. I think what I'll focus on here are the two bills in Maryland as they both passed and were enacted. These bills would require the Public Service Commission to solicit and approve proposals for certain energy projects. And then it goes beyond that to say that the commission is required by October of last year to solicit energy projects that can replace retiring coal or oil capacity. And then within that, the bill required that any natural gas projects be designed for eventual conversion to hydrogen. So again, this is a very evident one that could also fit in broader energy strategy, but just because of that approval that is granted here to the Public Service Commission, we ultimately chose to put it within this subcategory, but also can really see how states are starting to think forward in their energy planning and the role that hydrogen can play. Next slide, please. Okay, category 1 is done, moving to category 2. So this is looking at planning, research, and strategy. We saw 10 states put forward 17 bills related to planning, research, and strategy. And again, from the bar graph, you can see that we further divided these into three different subcategories, which I'll walk through in a moment. And then similar to the last graphs, we can see that the dark yellow shows the total number of bills introduced. And in this case, there is no light yellow simply because none were enacted. But across this broader category, we saw states considering what the role of hydrogen will be in their broader state energy strategies, and then also some specific use cases and applications for hydrogen. Next slide. Okay, so the first subcategory is related to broader state energy strategy. And then within this subcategory, it is very close to what it sounds. We really saw different ways that states are considering how to perhaps increase hydrogen supply, reach broader net zero goals with hydrogen as a lever for doing so, and then also some approaches to utility planning. So looking at this example, I think calling out perhaps Florida because we saw two different bills introduced that was really focusing on proposing how the state could reach net zero carbon emissions by 2051. And it did specifically include text around how municipal natural gas-fired units and combined heat and power generation technology would reach those goals. And within the bill, there was an exception that if facilities were converted to green hydrogen or a similar type of technology, that would provide an exception for some of the other requirements to meet goals by 2045. So again, just an interesting integration of a state kind of proposing and starting to think through the role of hydrogen in reaching these broader mid-century goals. We can do the next slide. Okay, the second subcategory is around natural gas innovation and transition. And so we're really in 2025, we were looking at states that were considering hydrogen as a way to either innovate natural gas or in some ways transition away from it, which included looking at hydrogen blending in existing pipeline systems, and then also the highest and best use cases for hydrogen, such as industrial applications. I think an example on this slide that I'd like to highlight is in Illinois. There were a series of different bills introduced that all were seeking to amend the Public Utilities Act by adding, among other things, adding a 2050 heat decarbonization standard article. And so within that, there was a pathway study that would explore how investor-owned natural gas utilities could reach net zero by mid-century. And again, that included the role of alternative fuels like green hydrogen. And then from that study would develop a heat decarbonization plan. And this was interesting. There was text that said green hydrogen could only be used for industrial applications and that there could be no blending of hydrogen with methane. Next slide, please. All right. The next subcategory, again, still under the broader planning, research, and strategy, is around different types of studies. And I think I might just run through all of these examples since they are a little bit shorter. But generally, in the subcategory, we were seeing bills where states were considering the benefits and trade-offs of hydrogen, as well as different production methods, how to integrate hydrogen with other advanced energy sources. And then we also saw some data center application being considered. So specifically, well, maybe I'll just jump down to Minnesota first. So Minnesota SF 2926 was specifically looking to study and evaluate geologic hydrogen potential in the state. And then two bills, one in Oklahoma and one in Oregon, but actually with similar intent. We're both seeking to mandate nuclear feasibility studies. And those studies would include looking into how advanced clean energy technologies like hydrogen could be integrated with nuclear in the state. And then finally, the Virginia bill, good to highlight because I know data centers are probably increasingly on all of our minds, but Virginia HB 2578 was looking to examine the cost and feasibility of data centers using alternatives to diesel for backup or primary generation. And we saw that green hydrogen ready fuel cells was included as one of the technologies that could be a viable alternative. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to our third category. I know I'm going through these pretty quick here, so thank you for hanging on with me. Market formation and incentives. We definitely saw the greatest quantity of bills introduced in this category, and I'll share a little bit more about what was attributing to that. We saw 10 states put forward 40 bills related to market formation and incentives. And at least from a tracking standpoint, this was a pretty exciting topic to get to follow just because we saw a lot of bill activity, but also a lot of variety in the types of market mechanisms that states were considering. So again, the graph, that dark blue, shows you the number of total bills introduced, and then the lighter blue shows you the number of bills enacted. Across this category, we were seeing states consider ways to support the formation of hydrogen markets. And so there are a lot of different types of incentives, including appropriations, different types of funds or programs, tax credits or preferences. And then, of course, you always need an other category to capture some of the other options being considered. Next slide. All right, the first category is appropriations. This one is a pretty straightforward category as it simply states using appropriations and finding ways to fund hydrogen work or projects. There's a little bit of text that's quite small at the top, but just calling out that there were 21 bills related to the appropriations category, but that was actually coming from 3 states. And so in California, there were 3 bills, Minnesota, there were 15, and then Washington, there were also 3. Looking at the 2 examples, and so both of these were enacted, and the first being Minnesota, and I'd mentioned this earlier. There were also other projects that were considered throughout the legislative session last year, but these were the 2 that ultimately were a part of an appropriations package for fiscal year 2026 and 2027. So 2 different projects, 2 different funding. And there's under $1 million is for this renewable energy conversion, and it's a farm diesel and ammonia project that will also help enable production of enable low-cost production of hydrogen. And then there's a little over $3 million that will be to the city of St. Cloud in Minnesota, and specifically to install green hydrogen production. And that green hydrogen is seen as a fuel source both for decarbonizing community transportation, but also manufacturing. And then the second state to highlight here is Washington, also SB 5167, which was enacted. This appropriations bill was covering the year 2025 to 2027 and included 2 amounts, just over $1 million, both supporting work related to hydrogen. So again, kind of reading this here for you, but the first one was around testing hydrogen combustion and specifically for the related NOx emissions. There's also a line for technical assistance for strategically using hydrogen, as well as looking into feasibility of underground storage. And then there was also a line for an environmental justice toolkit for hydrogen projects. The second amount also covers quite a bit. The line for hydrogen is specifically supporting contracted services for green hydrogen and clean energy manufacturing programs. But again, keep directing you back to the tracker. It's a really great tool to get to these state websites directly and kind of dive in and also start to track some of these projects as they develop. Next slide, please. Okay, our next subcategory under market formation and incentives is funds and programs. And so in this case, we're seeing states consider a lot of different things, but grants, rebate programs, other incentive programs, and other dedicated funds to support hydrogen. So a couple of examples here, and I will just run through them all. New York was looking at establishing a renewable hydrogen incentive grant program. Oklahoma was looking at creating an investment rebate program. This was a little more broad for other qualified capital expenditures. but it also included those that related to hydrogen, and both blue and green hydrogen were specified in the text. In Texas, there was consideration for establishing a clean hydrogen development fund to finance clean hydrogen projects. And there was also a tax incentive as part of that, which would be equivalent to 20% of qualified expenditures. And then finally, Washington, related to alternative jet fuels, was considering developing a competitive grant program that would support production and use of those alternative fuels. And again, green electrolytic hydrogen was included in that. Next slide, please. Next, we're moving on to tax credit and preference or eligibility. And so this is also pretty straightforward, but we're seeing states consider ways to leverage tax credits and other tax exemption or preference to support a developing hydrogen market. In this case, I will highlight the New Jersey A5687, and also encourage folks to get on the New Jersey site and look at this program. The website is live and I believe accepting applications for projects that would like to take advantage of the tax credit. So essentially this would and has established the Next New Jersey Manufacturing Program. This is a very comprehensive tax credit program, and the goal is to incentivize in-state manufacturing and job creation more broadly. And there is a portion of it carved out, I believe, in the first few years that provides some preference for clean energy technologies, and that includes green hydrogen. And then as well on this list, we saw a couple different bills in Pennsylvania that were also going to create tax credits that would support clean energy projects, and in doing so, including clean hydrogen as a qualified technology. Next slide, please. All right, getting to our last subcategory, and that is other. So this is a broader category, and it's really designed to try to capture and highlight some really interesting examples of how states are considering hydrogen, both how it's eligible for incentives, different performance-based standards. There's also a bill in Hawaii that's looking at a special purpose revenue bond to support a project, and then other ways to allocate revenue from other state funding streams to help support hydrogen. I think to highlight Hawaii, because we have actually seen a similar bill that is showing up in 2026 and is part of the digest that we sent this morning. But Hawaii SB 585 was seeking to issue a special purpose revenue bond that would assist a company in constructing a facility, and it would incorporate advanced technology to produce green hydrogen using renewable energy. So just again, kind of an interesting thing to see how states are considering what is the best fit for our state when it comes to trying to help develop these hydrogen markets, and what are the options available as far as market mechanisms. Pennsylvania SB 503 and HB 503 was seeking to establish a state-run cap and invest program. And then here is where we're seeing Pennsylvania consider how could some of that revenue generated through auction of emissions allowances become available to support different grant programs, including for clean hydrogen production. Next slide. Perfect. Our fourth category is technology, scope, and eligibility. And we saw 5 different states put forward bills touching on this category. Across these bills, we saw states that were looking at adding or removing definitions pertaining to hydrogen and its eligibility for programs and application. And we've combined these just into a single slide because, as you can see, there were several bills introduced, but none of these bills were enacted. That being said, I think it is important to remember the value and the role that definition does play in legislation, and to just see some of the examples of where this is showing up. Next slide, please. Okay, perfect. Something got funky on my computer. There we go. Okay, as I said, we combined those 2 subcategories just for the sake of this slide. But again, we're seeing states consider the definition of clean hydrogen, where it does and doesn't show up in legislation or existing statute. And we're also seeing states consider eligibility use cases for hydrogen. I think an interesting example from Illinois is that there was a bill that was actually looking to restore statutes to a previous form. And so we saw in that bill that was considered the removal of green hydrogen and repeal of several different acts. So again, a good example to just remember that this is an evolving conversation. And so we do want to track both sides of that conversation and just have an understanding of how it's evolving over time. Another bill to highlight here would be perhaps the Pennsylvania HB 501 and SB 501. And again, this is amending and renaming an existing act and then adding several definitions for clean hydrogen based on how it's produced. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to our final category, last but not least, is symbolic and awareness. And this is actually primarily made up of resolutions. So again, just using the word bill as shorthand. But we saw 6 states put forward bills that were symbolic or sought to raise awareness. And as you can see from this graph, this is actually where we saw the most legislative activity advance and at the highest rates. And so we had 5 different resolutions passed that I will share more about in a moment. But we're seeing in this case in 2025 that several states were really affirming energy priorities through resolutions or urging the federal government, or in one case, regional transmission operators to take very specific actions. Next slide, please. All right, the first subcategory is around hydrogen or energy days. And again, there were 3 resolutions passed in this category in 3 different states. And we do recognize that there is a lot of symbolism to these, but it is very interesting as well to see where these states are putting this forward. I'll start with Texas, which is actually on the bottom, but Texas kicked us off in 2025. So this was a resolution that was recognizing March 19th as Texas Hydrogen Day, and really acknowledging the role that hydrogen plays and that Texas plays in the U.S. hydrogen economy, having being a top producer of hydrogen and actually the top producer of hydrogen. Again, I would encourage folks to go read these resolutions. It's just very interesting to sort of see the framing and see where states are at and how they are conceptualizing and articulating the value of hydrogen in their energy strategies. The next was in Louisiana, and so Louisiana recognized May 6th as Louisiana Renewable Energy Day. And identified hydrogen as a versatile energy carrier, and also just stated that there is a lot of potential for the clean hydrogen sector, and for that to be very significant in the state. And then finally, California followed later in October, designating October 8th as California Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Day. And this resolution recognizes the importance of hydrogen and fuel cell technologies in building a cleaner, more resilient future in the state. Next slide, please. All right, I think you're way ahead of me. Thank you. All right, the final subcategory here is urging the federal government or regional transmission operators to take particular action. And so we saw at least here the 3 examples from North Dakota, Alaska, and California. Looking at North Dakota, so this resolution did pass, and it urges the 2 regional transmission operators to effectively address market failures that have led to retiring dispatchable power generation having outpaced its replacement. And again, this is where hydrogen is really tucked within the language, but hydrogen is included as part of the state's diversified energy strategy. And then both in Alaska and California, I'll leave folks to read these in more detail on your own time, but these were specific cases where these resolutions were stating a value in the state and then also really urging the federal government to protect, maintain, and continue to provide project and financial support. And I think it comes as no surprise that California in particular had highlighted the $1.2 billion in federal support that had been slated for the Arches Hydrogen Hub. Next slide, please. Okay, that brings us to the end of our 5 main categories. I'm going to go over some high-level cross-cutting takeaways. As I mentioned, our 2026 digest went out this morning, so we hope that you will kind of join us in seeing how this evolves this year. But just based on the categories we just explored together, we can see that there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of variety in how states are approaching hydrogen legislation, but enactment remains very selective. You also saw that hydrogen is typically tracked within bills that have a much broader scope, which makes the tracking of them very fun, but we have a good time. So we get to dig through these bills and try to find where hydrogen is showing up because it's not always the primary focus of the text. And then, of course, we talked about how the number of introduced bills related to hydrogen doubled from 2024 to 2025. I don't think we'll see doubling again in 2026, but I'll be very interested to see where we fall on that 100 threshold. If we do go closer to 50 or if we start to see increased conversation. And then similarly with the advancement of legislation, direct state funding does remain a pretty high bar. But like we saw in the market category, states are really exploring options and getting creative to figure out what could work in their respective states. And then policy activity, of course, is very widespread. Even though we are seeing regional pockets, what these policies focus on are really addressing where each state is in this conversation. And then we are anticipating potentially more states with higher concentrations. And I think that will just largely depend on how these conversations advance, but it is definitely a takeaway that we saw, particularly in that market formation category. I think I have a couple more slides here, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Emma. But just a quick, I've already mentioned the digest and the tracker, but if you do not receive the digest, just a reminder that we send that on a weekly basis, starting in early February, late January. So if you'd like to stay informed, please do reach out and we can add you to the list. And then the tracker itself updates automatically, which is really nice. So as bills advance, you can also just track that live and then look for the digest in your inbox on a weekly basis. Next slide. All right, and then this is just a quick view. So again, if you're not familiar with the tracker itself, there's a really nice interactive map. Our goal is to really make bills accessible for everyone. So this can serve as a one-stop shop. And then, like I mentioned, there are URLs that will take you out to the state legislative website so you can really dig in more. But the map is a really great place to start to get that high-level view of what the year is looking like. And then you can click on a state to view all relevant legislation in that state. And that will cover both carbon management, hydrogen, and procurement, but then you can filter down by topic as well. Next slide. And then this is just another view of how you can use the filters in the tracker. So one of the benefits, as I'd already mentioned, this does update automatically. So you can stay informed if you have this bookmarked, or you can stay updated with our digest and then reference this as you would like. And yeah, I think that I've already said everything else I was going to see on this slide. You can go to the next slide, Emma. Okay, I am now going to turn it over to my colleague Emma to share a little bit more about another resource that we have coming soon. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks, Alana. Hey, everybody. I just want to thank Alana really quick for that great overview of the 2025 hydrogen legislation that we saw this year. And on that note, one thing that we hear often from our stakeholders is that it's helpful to put that new activity or previous year's activity in context to understand what states have already done related to hydrogen regulation or policy, and where there are still gaps or open questions in different states. And so I wanted to take the opportunity today to briefly preview a resource we're building in collaboration with the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. It's a hydrogen legislative web map. And the University of Wyoming team has done a really great job in tracking down state level hydrogen laws, regulations, and policy actions. And we're super excited to turn that into an interactive map that's easy to explore and use for all of you that are interested in what's going on in the hydrogen space. This map is going to track hydrogen-related statutes, regulations, incentives, and policy frameworks from the early 2000s through today, and hopefully let you see how hydrogen projects are regulated and supported across different states, and perhaps how approaches have evolved over time. Ideally, our hope is that this is a practical resource you can come back to, whether you're trying to compare states, understand what's already in place, or ground conversations in what the policy landscape actually looks like. As far as timeline for this resource, right now we're finalizing its development and we're hoping to put it out in late February, but we will keep you up to date on the release as it grows closer. Okay, so on this slide here, you can see a draft page of the web map. On the map, like I said, you can explore hydrogen statutes and regulations by state. So you can start by selecting explore by state or explore by category to see what action has been taken related to hydrogen. In this example, we've clicked on the state tab and then clicked on Texas. You can see that Texas is kind of highlighted or glowing there. From there, we clicked on the storage category. Just going to pop that up right here. So we clicked on storage and then we narrowed further to the permits subcategory. And once you've clicked on a category or a subcategory, on the right-hand side of the web map, you're going to be able to see the details for that specific policy instance. So I've zoomed in on that right there. And this panel shows a plain language description of the statutory or regulatory provision, including what it applies to and how it functions. And you can also see where the authority lives in state law. So in this case, the storage permitting requirement is located in the Texas Administrative Code. And underneath that code, each entry is going to include direct links to the underlying statute or regulation so that you're able to click through to read the exact code language themselves, or in case you're curious to see what the surrounding code looks like. And if you look right on the top of each of these gray cells above storage permits, you'll see one of three, which means that Texas has three more pieces of code in this category that you would be able to read through and look at. You would just click through those arrows to see the different pieces of code. Now, if you chose to explore by category instead of explore by states, you'll be able to click on a category and then a subcategory to see what states across the U.S. have code in that policy bucket. And then similar to the other page of the web map that I just showed, you'll be able to scroll through the different instances of code on the top right. So here we've clicked on storage, we've clicked on permits. You can see the 6 states, I believe, that have some instance of code in those categories. And then you'll be able to look through the 12 different specific instances of code to compare across states. If you're curious how each state might be approaching regulation of hydrogen a little bit differently. Okay, and just to see how we broke it down in the web map to make it easy to understand and sort through, uh, I'm showing the 4 different policy categories here. In total, the University of Wyoming identified 306 unique policy instances across states. Again, most of these are going to be in state code, but that varies a little bit. So an instance in this case refers to a distinct statutory or regulatory action, but there is some overlap here as a piece of code can often address more than one category. But the general buckets include first incentives and financing. So this is going to include financial mechanisms that support hydrogen development, such as tax credits and exemptions, grants and loans, procurement programs, pilot funding, and utility cost recovery. The second bucket is permitting and production. These policies are going to govern the approval and oversight of hydrogen production facilities. So this includes environmental and air permits, certification requirements, and how hydrogen production is treated under state law. So, for example, as an industrial or as a stationary source. In our third bucket here, transport, those policies are going to cover rules for hydrogen pipelines and other transport infrastructure. So that includes pipeline safety standards, Public Utility Commission oversight, common carrier status, and siting or routing authority. Then for this fourth bucket, storage, those policies or pieces of code are going to focus specifically on hydrogen storage, particularly underground or cavern storage, and include permitting, monitoring, safety requirements, and operational standards, all related to storage. So if you think back to that map, if you click on the storage subcategory, those are the type of policies that are going to be listed in that right side with descriptions and links to code. Okay, I just wanted to zoom in to the incentives and financing category real quick, just to show the broad range of code and policies that we're seeing in this bucket. It includes traditional incentives like tax credits and grants, but also captures bond authority, utility cost recovery, and programs that treat hydrogen as an eligible clean energy or alternative fuel pathway. One thing that I felt was important to call out specifically here is that many of these policies are not standalone hydrogen laws. Instead, hydrogen often shows up because states have updated existing economic development programs, renewable portfolio standards, clean transportation programs, or tax codes to include hydrogen alongside other technologies. So the volume within this bucket here doesn't mean that states are handing out incentives, but it does reflect that hydrogen is often being integrated into broader systems for energy planning, or for industrial development, or transportation fuels, which is one reason why this category is so prominent in the data set and in state code. When we look at the rest of those instances of code or regulation, the pattern shifts a little bit. Um, and instead of seeing more of those specific hydrogen instances, we're seeing hydrogen being folded into existing regulatory systems. So, across transport, safety, permitting, and storage, hydrogen is pretty frequently regulated because it's defined as a gas, a flammable gas, or a hazardous material under a long-standing pipeline utility framework, or under oil and gas authorities. And because of this, many states already have enforceable agreements or enforceable requirements in place without needing to pass those hydrogen-only laws. The largest concentration in all of these instances of code is safety. Like I just mentioned, across many states, hydrogen is treated as a flammable gas, which typically brings it under public utility commissions, fire codes, or under pipeline safety authorities and federal standards that states enforce. And that's why safety appears so prominently in the data. Permits and siting are the next largest category. In most cases, hydrogen facilities are permitted as industrial sources, gas facilities, or energy infrastructure under existing environmental and utility laws. And so states often rely on these frameworks rather than, again, creating new permitting regimes specific to hydrogen. We also see activity around regulatory reviews, reporting, and agency authority. These policies are typically going to clarify which agencies are responsible, how information is reported, and how existing statutes apply as hydrogen projects moved from concept to development. And then finally, categories like property rights, unitization, and geologic hydrogen are also covered. Not as many times, but these are still important categories. And those topics typically tend to appear because hydrogen is raising new questions, particularly around underground storage or subsurface exploration, or where existing oil and gas law may not fully resolve all of those hydrogen specific issues. But overall, looking at these permitting, production, transport, and storage instances in code, the pattern is showing that states are primarily adapting and extending existing legal frameworks with targeted updates, where hydrogen is introducing new technical or legal considerations rather than building entirely new regulatory systems related to hydrogen from scratch. Okay, and that's all from me. We're really excited to put out this interactive historical legislative web map later in February. Really hope that it'll be a easy resource for all of you to turn to whenever you have quick questions about what states have already done and enacted related to hydrogen. And we'll be sure to keep you posted on the release. So with that, we'll now turn to questions for Alana on 2025 hydrogen legislation. We're going to try to answer these chronologically, but we'll reach out afterwards to answer any remaining questions.
So, for those who have stuck with us here to the end, I just do want to thank you all for joining us today. My name's Alana. My colleague Emma is here with me today. And then next week, we'll be diving into procurement legislation, which is our third and final webinar in this series. And we're really looking forward to welcoming two external speakers, one from Washington State and then another from Built Cold to join that conversation. And so with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day and we will talk to you all soon. Thank you very much. And Emma, to Emma's point, we will send you the resources from today's call. Thanks all. Take care.